The frontrunner in the contest to succeed Theresa May as Prime Minister, the former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, has been told by a judge that he will face a court case over accusations of misconduct in public office. The case centres on claims that he lied during the Brexit referendum campaign about the amount of money the UK paid to the EU. Let's get more on this with our news correspondent Andy Moore, who's following this for us. And Andy, this stems from a crowd-funded campaign.
That's right, crowd-funded to the tune of about £200,000. A Norfolk businessman, Marcus Ball, went to Magistrates Court and argued before a judge there that this was such a serious offence of lying by a very senior politician over such a major issue that it represented misconduct in public office, which is a very serious criminal offence. So this was an important stage along the way today. The Judge Coleman, said she wasn't making any decision about the facts. The case was unproven, but she said there was a case to answer, so she's sending it on to the next stage. So that means that Mr Johnson will have to appear personally at Westminster Magistrates Court to face 3 charges of misconduct in public office, basically the same offence over different timescales. And then it will go to a Crown Court because it is such a serious issue that carries possibly, if found guilty, more than a 6-month jail sentence.
Do we have a date for that next court appearance?
No, we don't have a date for that yet.
OK, I'm wondering just in the context, obviously, of the Conservative leadership election and when that might happen. Has Mr Johnson said anything about this since we last spoke when the story was breaking an hour ago?
We've not heard from Mr Johnson himself. We know what his view really is from the argument put forward by his lawyers at the previous hearing. And they said this was basically a political stunt brought by anti-Brexit campaigners. That politicians, you know, in the rough and tumble of a campaign are free to make claims, and they will be held their feet to the fire by other politicians, and they'll be challenged on them. I mean, one politician, David Miller, has said it's ridiculous if a politician is going to face possibly a criminal charge for every time they're accused of lying. He says this is just nuts, and that senior judges will be holding their heads in wonder at what a junior judge has decided.
OK, very interesting. Andy, thank you very much. Well, let's get more on this with our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, in Westminster. So, Norman, what could this mean for Mr Johnson's leadership campaign?
Well, the first thing you have to say is the timing could hardly be more damaging, given that we are now in a leadership campaign in which Mr Johnson is widely seen as the favourite, and yet even before he's got out the blocks to formally launch his campaign, set out his ideas, the headlines are all going to be about the fact he's now facing a court case with, at the end of the day, a potential prison sentence. The second thing, obviously, about it is the massive distraction it is for Team Johnson. Here they are trying to hone their message, and yet they are now going to have to spend quite a bit of time, I would imagine, trying to dampen down this story and come up with a credible riposte to it. And it does open up really the extraordinary potential juxtaposition of Mr Johnson appearing in court, and he himself will have to appear in court, appearing in court at precisely the same time as he is appealing to, yes, the Tory party, but also the nation to trust him to become the next Prime Minister. And both those processes will be going on at precisely the same time. And the last thing which seems to me is, inevitably, it will be used by his critics, and I expect will reignite the question marks about the character question, about Mr Johnson's character, because we know throughout his political career he has, you know, faced all sorts of scrapes, and the criticism has come, you know, from his own side. Michael Howard sacked him. Michael Gove, who was leading his leadership campaign last time, decided that he just didn't think he was a fit person, and in effect brought his campaign to an end by saying he could not support him. It seems to me that although this is, you know, just a summons, it's not a verdict, the simple fact this case is now going ahead will reignite those character questions and will be used by Mr Johnson's critics.
And I guess more broadly, Norman, politicians will look at this and consider that, you know, if a private individual wants to crowdfund a case against an MP, you know, then it can lead to court like this one is.
Well, I'm sure Mr. Johnson's allies, and we've yet to hear from his team, I think they will be issuing a statement, but are just looking at the sort of the legal parameters of what they can say. I'm sure those around Mr. Johnson will just say, well, this is, you know, just people who are bitterly opposed to the Brexit referendum, seeking to cause as much damage as possible. Indeed, if you look at the court papers, the judge actually points out that Mr. Johnson's team argued that this case was being brought to secure as much publicity as possible, presumably to damage the case for Brexit and to damage Mr. Johnson. Now, he ruled that there was a case to answer and that the allegations were not vexatious. But I suspect there will be quite a few people at Westminster who think, well, you know, this is the cut and thrust of politics, and if you're going to force politicians to potentially face legal action for every set of statistics they use, then you are really going to severely constrain political argument.
Okay, Norman, thank you very much for that. Norman Smith.